Hello and welcome. This is Guy Glidden, and this is the second of 4 lessons on Excel skills. The first lesson was on the basics. This lesson is really on 2 topics. It's on using wizard function and setting up a pivot table. So that's basically what we're going to be doing today. This is simply shows you a sheet from the lesson section, or the lesson sheet on the Excel file that you're going to get. And to make this work today, I'm going to go over and I'm going to go to a special file I created over here, which I'm going to clean up right now so we can start afresh. What I've done is I've simply taken the reading score file and I have taken only selected scores from the reading score file. Basically, there were 4 schools in the reading score file. I only selected one of the schools. By getting a smaller number of cases in here, it's simply going to mean that you're going to get less blurry-eyed watching this, because it's not going to take you as long for me to go from the top and the bottom to the file. A little word about this file. This is an actual, was originally a real test score file, real people, and I simply modified it to continue to use it because, frankly, it's awfully hard to come up with authentic test score files if you're making them up. Fiction is a lot harder than reality, and so this is one school, has IDs for the student in terms of name and an ID number. It provides the gender for the person, so we can do comparisons on that later, and you'll see where that's important. It has the race. It has a group, which basically is a division of general ed and special ed students. And then it has 4 subscores, which we're going to move over here so you can see them. There's a narrative score, an expository score, a technical score, a persuasive score in high school reading, a total, which is an average of the 4. And then I have a performance category by number and a performance category by definition. So again, tests have changed considerably, but the format's really pretty much the same as you're going to see now, and it will serve our purposes really nicely. With that, we're going to look right here at this little thing called the function wizard, and to make this work, I'm going to go right down to the bottom of the file, which I'm going to pull up right now, because what we want to do to make the function wizard work is we want to put the icon in the cell where we want our computation to show up. And if we're doing things with a column of test scores, which we're going to be doing, it's a really good idea to put your live cell, and the information will result at the bottom of that file, so you know what you're doing. So let's start with the most basic thing, which I've already demonstrated before. I've got the cursor at the bottom of the file. I'm going to hit the function wizard button, and the floating member comes up. Now, a few minutes on the, just so you know what you're doing, there's a whole directory, or actually several directories of functions that you can use. And the functions are all pre-programmed computation devices that Excel is providing for you. I'm using the most recent used category because everything I'm going to use here today is in that, but there's also one that's going to provide all, and if you do that on your Excel file, you'll find that's where you'll probably have to start. Only after you use things once will it appears in the most recent. There's a ton of things here, so you do have to pay attention to the names of the things you're going to be doing, and I'm going to be providing you with a set of names in the directory of this file as where to find these things. So let's go back to most recently used, and the thing that we probably want to show first, because we've done this before, is we want to do an average. Average is an arithmetic average. Technically it's called a mean, but somehow Excel simply wants to still call it an average. Now, because I put the cursor at the bottom of a row of numbers, Excel is making an assumption, which is right in this case, that I want to do an average of the numbers in that column, and that happens to be a set of test scores. So I put down G2 colon G101. And what I would suspect you do every time is you hand check that to make sure that's what you want to do. I always verify by hand and never assume that everything's right. I do an OK, scroll to the bottom of the screen, and here's an average. Now, one thing I like to do with my averages is I would like to have at least 1 decimal point. So I go to Format Cells in the little floating menu that I look, and I pick this up incidentally with the right mouse, gives me the floating menu, Format Cells, go to Number, and I simply want this to do by 1 decimal point is fine for here. So it's really an 85.2 Let me bump that up in size so you can see that a little better here. Now again, remember dragging the function. I can drag the functions across and away we go. So now I've completed test score averages for everything in my file. Now, since I'm kind of a worrywart about organizing numbers, I want to do one other thing, and I notice that's here. So I'll put my cursor right down here. I go back to Function Wizard. This time I want to do a median because I'm kind of interested in the middle score. And I know a little bit about numbers, and I know that if I look at a column of numbers, and if the median and the mean are the same, it's a pretty symmetric distribution. If they're not, I need to look at the bias or the skew. So I'm going to hit the median word, and I'm going to go up here. Now look up here. This is where I need to do a hand adjustment. It popped up G2 colon G102. Well, that's not right because in cell G101, I'm sorry, I already have, in cell G102, I already have the average. I just want the array of numbers that I want to compute them on, so I have to back off to that range, G2 to G101. I hit the OK button. And again, now that pops up as a 9089. Now notice that's a little bit higher than that. Whoa. I know a little bit. I know that this is a distribution where there are 100 points possible in each of these subtests. Theoretically, I guess one could get a 0, but I know from the structure of this test, these are two-choice items, in other words, like a true-false test. So it's not very likely we're going to have many scores that are below 50% success rate. But still, that's awfully high in the distribution, since 100 is the top possible score. And you notice there's a little skew in all these numbers. Not a lot, but a little bit of a skew. Now, since I'm a worrywart and I want to add a little more information, there's another thing I can do with this information. So I'm going to go down. I'm going to use Function Wizard one more time up here. And I found out here something called stdev, which happens to be the code that Excel uses for standard deviation. Now, you may remember when I provided you with the background information about measurement concepts, I told you this was a nice handy device to have, and you can compare this with your notes on the standard distribution that are in this lesson, so I don't waste time today going into it. So let's hit standard deviation and do an OK. Now again, I got to go back up and I got to do an adjustment, because I only want to do that for the number of sorts. So, and here we go. We're doing this again. And whoa, okay, now I have I have a pretty good idea of the distribution of these numbers. I know they're all a little bit skewed in that the middle score is always a little bit above the arithmetic average. So I got a lot of high scores in this distribution. I see that now a neat way, if I want to use this in a practical concept, I can take this number in the standard deviation, I can do a plus or minus on the mean or the arithmetic average, and I can get a pretty good idea of what the broad elements of the distribution look like. What it really means in kind of simple terms is, if I add the standard deviation and subtract it, so I've got a plus and minus, standard deviation 1 from 85.2. Numbers that are above and below that level are what I would call outliers. So for example, right above me, I have a score that's a 54. That's a pretty low score in this process. So that's a practical use right away. I might want to use that in an area. Okay, I'm going to do one more quick demonstration of this and then we're going to get out of this. You're going to hear me talking to some other things about something called a correlation coefficient. On this menu, Pearson is a man's name, but that's a correlation coefficient for two variables. Okay, now if I punch that button, now here it's confused about the array because now I have two arrays. So let's say I want to compare narrative scores, which is G2, G101, with total score, that's K2, K101. Help if I would correct that. I always got to read your work carefully and do an OK button. That gives me a correlation coefficient comparing narratives test scores, that's this file right here, with the total test scores. Now, the correlation is pretty high, but I expected it would, because remember, this is simply an average of these other 4 subscores in testing. So, but that just will demonstrate what we got going. Let's move on, because I got one other thing I want to do here, and to this one I'm going to take my time and get up to the top of the menu, because I'm going to, in the remainder of this lesson, simply show you a little bit about setting up pivot table. Not going to use it very much in this lesson. That's what comes up in the next lesson. To find pivot table, you go under the insert icon, and over in the corner you see pivot table. I'm going to punch on it. Okay, now I got it confused here. Hang on a minute here. I'm not sure why it's doing that, but it's a little confused, and I think I need to wipe up these things on the bottom here in order to, so let me do a little cleanup work here, guys. We're going to try this again now. Now we're going to go back in again. Okay, and we're going to go to insert, and we're going to go to pivot table. Okay, now this is what should happen, and that's what I had confused it. It says the range is Reading School 101, and that's the name of my sheet, and it wants the pivot table to start over here from cell A1, and that's the upper left-hand corner, and it tells me that the bottom right dimension of my pivot cell range is M101, and that's correct. This is column M, and this is 101. I'm not touching the keyboard, because if I do, it's going to screw it up. And I hit an OK button. Okay, now look what happens over here. And I'm going to move this over here so you can see this. I have 2 things that appeared on my sheet. One is something that calls drop data items here, and another is a possible table field list. If you get those things to pop up, pat yourself on the back, because that's all it amounts to. Now, almost all of you will, because this is going to happen automatically if you have Excel in the newer versions. The only problem would be where if we're locating somebody who's trying to do this, who has an old version of Excel, 2003 or earlier, you probably need to give me a message, because you're going to have a more difficult thing to get this menu to come up. Okay, now this is a blank menu right now. Well, let me show you a use of it here, and I'm going to do one thing here. I'm going to take narrative test scores, and I'm going to put it in the values column here. Now, I wanted to sum it, and so it simply came up with a sum of that, which isn't very, sorry about that. That isn't a very valuable thing to have, so I'm going to change that back over here. And notice I'm just going to keep on going back and forth, even though you might get a little foggy doing this. I'm going to change use my left mouse to, it says value field settings. I want to change that to a count. And by doing that, I have come up with a count, and it simply tells me there are 100 scores in the process. Now, this is just the primarily, because here's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do something. You're asked in one of the other lessons to do something called a frequency distribution. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the narrative icon again and put it under the row labels and drop it down here. And then I want to show you what I have accomplished over here. Notice, it shows me a distribution of scores of people who took this test. The lowest little person is somebody who got a 48, a 51, and it tells me not only the numbers on the scale where there is a test score, but it tells me the frequency, the number of scores at that level. So I keep on moving up a little bit here. I'm going to scroll up a little bit here, and you'll see here that we have one person that got a score as high as 100, but notice 7 got a 94. This is a frequency distribution. So if you're looking at this assignment, okay, what I've done here is I've set up a pivot table. So that's what we want to pick up on strains here. We're about to run out of time, but we're going to renew this lesson. So the whole point was to give you a beginning start on pivot table and to show function wizard.